I was the outcast no one wanted at the table until the inheritance turned me into the only relative that mattered. For 26 years, I was the family disappointment. While my cousins graduated from Ivy League schools and married into old money, I dropped out of community college and worked at a gas station. Holiday dinners were exercises in humiliation. My aunt seated me at the kids' table well into my 20s, claiming there wasn't room at the adult table. Uncle introduced me as the one who never figured it out. Mom apologized for my existence with nervous laughter. The comparisons were relentless. My cousin made partner at a prestigious law firm and bought her second vacation home. My brother finished his residency at Johns Hopkins with 3 hospitals competing for his services. Sister married a tech executive and managed charity galas from her mansion. Then there was me, smelling like motor oil, living in a studio where the heat barely worked. When my grandfather fell ill with pancreatic cancer, the family vultures circled with calculated precision. They took turns visiting his bedside, each trying to secure their piece of his fortune. My cousin brought homemade soup and casually left estate planning brochures on his nightstand. My brother hired a geriatric care specialist while mentioning his mounting student loans. Sister suddenly developed interest in Granddad's war stories, recording them while asking detailed questions about his Purple Heart and the medals in his bedroom safe. They coordinated visits through a family group chat I wasn't included in, dividing up days to ensure Granddad always had someone reminding him of their devotion. Each visit followed the same pattern: bring something thoughtful but cheap, stay long enough to seem caring, work money into conversation naturally. I was explicitly uninvited to these deathbed vigils. Mom claimed seeing me might upset him, given my lifestyle choices and recent mistakes. Translation: my poverty embarrassed them in front of nursing staff, so I stayed away, working doubles while they plotted inheritance strategies in the hospital cafeteria. The funeral was pure theater. Everyone wore designer black and shared heartwarming memories I'd never heard. My cousin delivered a tearful eulogy about their special bond, despite never having real conversations with him. The pastor kept mispronouncing his name, calling him Robert instead of Raymond. After the service, the lawyer announced Granddad's will would be read immediately. Everyone filed into the conference room practically drooling. My cousin had her calculator ready. Brother checked stock prices. Sister discussed interior designers with Mom, planning to redecorate Granddad's house once she inherited it. The lawyer started with small bequests that felt like appetizers. Mom got antique jewelry worth maybe $15,000. Uncle got the boat and lake house. Sister got vintage cars, including the coveted 1967 Mustang. Each inheritance met polite disappointment. Everyone held their breath for the main event. Then he said my name. Complete silence except fluorescent humming. Someone gasped. The lawyer continued about the house worth $2 million, the business, investment accounts. Something about being the only one who never asked for anything. My cousin shot up, face crimson, demanding a mistake. Mom cried tears of rage, not joy. Uncle pounded the table demanding documents. Sister accused me of manipulating a senile old man during his vulnerable final months. That's when the lawyer smiled and dropped the real bombshell. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope with my name written in Granddad's increasingly shaky handwriting. The envelope was heavy and substantial, clearly containing multiple documents and pages. As I opened it with trembling hands while the entire room watched in tense silence, the lawyer explained that Granddad had specifically requested I read this letter aloud to the entire family immediately after the will reading. He'd made it a legal requirement for claiming any part of the inheritance. Every single word had to be read in front of witnesses and recorded for the court record. The letter was dated just 3 months before his death, written on his personal stationery with the family crest embossed at the top in gold leaf. As I began reading it aloud, my voice shaking with nervousness and emotion, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees, and the silence became absolutely deafening. My dear grandson, it began in Granddad's formal but unmistakably warm tone. For 26 years, I've watched this family treat you like a failure and a disappointment of the highest order. They measured your worth exclusively by your bank account balance and social status, finding you lacking in every possible way that mattered to their narrow worldview. They mocked your struggles, dismissed your efforts as insufficient, and excluded you from family gatherings because your presence reminded them that success isn't always measured in dollars and prestige. But I saw something entirely different when I bothered to look past their constant criticism and actually observe who you really were beneath all their harsh judgments and cruel dismissals. Every Christmas since you turned 18, you were the only family member who asked about my health and well-being, instead of immediately steering conversations toward my finances, estate planning, or inheritance expectations. While others calculated potential inheritance splits over holiday dinner, you asked about my arthritis flare-ups, whether I was sleeping well through the night, if the new medications were helping with my chronic pain and mobility issues. When your grandmother died 5 years ago, you were the only family member who helped me go through her belongings without cataloging their monetary value or arguing over who should inherit her jewelry, antiques, and valuable collections. You cried with me over her old love letters that revealed the depth of our 60-year romance, and laughed at her terrible cooking stories that no one else wanted to hear anymore because they weren't profitable or useful. You spent an entire weekend helping me organize her photo albums chronologically, listening to my rambling memories about each picture without checking your phone constantly, making excuses to leave early, or suggesting we hire someone else to handle such tedious emotional work. You treated me like a human being with thoughts, feelings, and wisdom accumulated over 8 decades, not like a walking bank account with a terminal illness and a countdown timer until inheritance distribution. The letter continued with devastating specificity about each family member's calculated behavior over the years. Your cousin spent our last meaningful conversation 3 weeks ago discussing real estate investment opportunities in emerging markets and asking if I'd considered selling the lake house since I was apparently too old and frail to use it properly anymore for recreational purposes. She brought professionally prepared legal documents about living trusts, estate planning strategies, and asset protection schemes, suggesting I might want to simplify my complex financial affairs before my condition worsened further and potentially affected my decision-making capacity. Your brother pitched me on some complicated cryptocurrency investment scheme during my chemotherapy sessions, explaining with charts and graphs how I could potentially triple my remaining money before I died if I just trusted his medical school expertise with financial markets and emerging technologies. He actually brought printed research, market analysis, and investment prospectuses to the hospital, spreading them across my bed table while poison dripped into my veins through an IV, and I struggled with nausea, exhaustion, and the existential terror of watching my body slowly fail. The room remained completely silent, except for my increasingly steady voice reading his devastating observations about their mercenary behavior. But you, my dear boy, you sat with me for hours watching those old black and white war movies I love, never once checking your phone or making excuses about prior commitments, work deadlines, or social obligations that were apparently more important than spending time with a dying old man. You brought me books from the library because you remembered I'd mentioned wanting to read more military history about the Pacific Theater, and you'd actually listen when I explained the historical context or shared stories about men I'd served with who didn't make it home. You listened to my rambling stories about your grandmother without glazing over, changing the subject to something more entertaining, or suggesting we watch television instead because my memories were boring or repetitive. You understood that those stories were precious to me, not burdensome obligations to be endured until you could politely escape. I had to pause to catch my breath as the accusations became increasingly specific and personally damning for each family member. Your mother called me exactly twice in the past year, both times to request substantial loans for personal expenses that she presented as urgent necessities. Once for her kitchen renovation project that she claimed was essential for maintaining the house's property value and her social standing in the neighborhood. Once for her luxury vacation to Europe that she insisted was necessary for her mental health and stress management following her divorce proceedings. She presented detailed budgets, payment plans, and justifications for why these expenditures were investments rather than frivolous spending, treating our phone conversations like banking appointments rather than family connections. She never called just to check on my well-being, share news about her daily life, or maintain any kind of emotional relationship that didn't involve financial transactions or requests for monetary assistance. When I suggested we have lunch together or spend time without any financial agenda, she was always too busy with her social commitments, volunteer work, book club meetings, and other obligations that apparently took priority over spending time with her dying father during his final months on Earth. Your uncle visited exactly 4 times in the past 2 years, each visit ending with him asking to borrow substantial amounts of money for his perpetually failing restaurant, or suggesting I invest in his latest business venture that was guaranteed to double my money within 6 months through his revolutionary new approach to the hospitality industry. He brought detailed business plans, financial projections, partnership agreements, and market research, clearly hoping to secure funding from someone he viewed as a wealthy investor, rather than a family member facing a terminal illness and limited time remaining. Even during my cancer treatments, when I was at my sickest and most vulnerable, every family member who walked through my hospital room door had a carefully planned financial agenda that involved accessing my wealth for their personal benefit and advancement. The letter went on for 6 more pages, each paragraph more damning and specific than the last. Granddad had documented specific conversations with precise dates, dollar amounts, and detailed descriptions of how each family member had approached him for money over the years. He'd kept a comprehensive journal of every family interaction during his illness, noting who asked for what, how they justified their increasingly bold requests, and how they responded when he didn't immediately agree to their financial proposals or investment schemes. The pattern was undeniable and thoroughly documented through meticulous record-keeping. Everyone except me had treated him like a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be loved, respected, and cared for during his final years of life. Your sister wanted me to co-sign a loan for her 3rd wedding ceremony, promising she'd pay me back after the divorce settlement from her 2nd marriage came through the courts and provided her with liquid assets. She brought mortgage applications, credit reports, and detailed financial statements to my birthday dinner last year, explaining how my excellent credit score and substantial assets could help her secure better interest rates and lower monthly payments for her dream wedding venue. She never asked about my treatment progress, whether I was experiencing significant pain, or how I was coping emotionally with my diagnosis and the reality of my approaching death. She spent most of our visits taking carefully staged photos for her social media accounts, posing with me to show her followers what a devoted and caring granddaughter she was, while privately calculating how much she could potentially borrow against her expected inheritance and discussing timeline concerns with her financial advisors. The financial requests had become increasingly aggressive and demanding as his condition worsened, and family members realized their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Your cousin asked for $100,000 to buy into her law firm's partnership track, claiming it was a strategic investment in the family's future legal protection and professional advancement that would benefit everyone through discounted legal services and insider knowledge of estate planning strategies. She presented a detailed business case explaining how her partnership would provide the family with legal expertise, professional connections, and financial advantages that would far exceed the initial investment over time. Your brother wanted $50,000 for medical conference attendance, continuing education courses, and professional development opportunities that he claimed would directly benefit my healthcare decisions and treatment planning during my remaining time. He suggested that his enhanced medical knowledge and professional networking would help me navigate complex treatment options, make better decisions about experimental therapies, and potentially extend my life through access to cutting-edge treatments and clinical trials that weren't available to ordinary patients. Your mother requested $30,000 for home improvements that would supposedly increase the property value for my eventual estate, presenting contractor estimates, renovation plans, and real estate projections that she claimed were essential for maintaining the family's real estate investments and maximizing returns for future generations. Each request came with elaborate justifications, detailed financial projections, and explanations of how the money would ultimately benefit me or preserve family wealth through strategic investments and asset protection. But you never asked for anything, never even hinted at financial need, or suggested that my wealth could solve your obvious problems and improve your difficult circumstances. When your car broke down last winter, leaving you without reliable transportation, you took the bus for 3 months through snow and ice, rather than call me for help with a down payment or loan for repairs that I would have gladly provided without conditions or expectations of repayment. When you lost your apartment deposit due to your landlord's illegal practices and had to find new housing immediately with limited resources, you moved into that terrible studio apartment with broken heating instead of asking family for assistance with moving costs, security deposits, or temporary housing that would have been easily within my means to provide. You worked overtime shifts at that gas station to afford Christmas gifts for everyone else while wearing the same worn-out clothes year after year, never suggesting that my resources could help you buy better clothing, find a better job, or improve your living situation in ways that would dramatically enhance your quality of life. When I offered to help you with college tuition or career training programs that could provide better opportunities, you politely declined, saying you didn't want to be a burden or create expectations you couldn't meet through your own efforts. When I suggested you apply for better jobs or consider starting your own business with proper funding, you thanked me for the encouragement but never asked for startup capital or financial backing that I would have gladly provided to see you succeed. The room was getting increasingly tense as family members realized how thoroughly their behavior had been documented, analyzed, and compared to my genuine care and concern over many years. So, I'm leaving you everything, the letter concluded with devastating finality, because you're the only one who loved me for who I was, rather than what I had in my bank accounts and investment portfolios. The house, the business, the investment accounts, the properties, all of it belongs to you now because you earned it through character rather than calculation. Use it wisely and don't let them guilt you into sharing what you earned through simple human decency, genuine affection, and authentic care for an old man's well-being during his darkest hours. They showed me their true colors repeatedly over many years, treating me like a bank account rather than a human being, and now you can show them yours. You have the character, integrity, and compassion to handle this responsibility properly because you understand that wealth is a tool for good, not just personal enrichment. Don't let their greed and manipulation convince you that you owe them anything beyond basic human courtesy. You earned this through love, not calculation, and that makes all the difference in the world. I folded the letter carefully as absolute chaos erupted around me like a bomb had detonated in the small conference room. Mom lunged across the table, trying to grab the pages from my hands, screaming that Granddad was clearly not of sound mind during his final months and had been systematically manipulated by my calculated fake concern and emotional exploitation designed to secure financial gain. Uncle threatened immediate legal action, claiming undue influence and elder abuse, demanding the will be overturned by any court in the state that understood basic justice and family rights. My cousin started frantically recording everything on her phone, probably already planning a comprehensive social media campaign about inheritance theft and elder abuse that would generate public sympathy, crowdfunding donations, and legal support from advocacy organizations that specialized in fighting inheritance fraud. She was already crafting her victim narrative in real time, positioning herself as the innocent granddaughter whose rightful inheritance had been stolen through sophisticated psychological manipulation and exploitation of a vulnerable elderly man. Sister began sobbing dramatically, wailing about how this catastrophic decision would destroy her children's college funds, her husband's business investments, and their family's entire financial future that had been built around the reasonable expectation of substantial inherited wealth. She accused me of systematically isolating Granddad from his loving family while pretending to be the devoted grandson, playing a long-term con game that had taken years to execute successfully through patience and careful planning. The accusations flew fast and vicious, each family member trying to outdo the others in painting me as a master manipulator worthy of criminal prosecution. I was called a sociopathic con artist, a predator who specialized in elder abuse, someone who had systematically poisoned Granddad's mind against his own family through calculated emotional manipulation and false affection designed solely to secure massive financial gain. Brother stood up and began pacing frantically around the small room, muttering about how this proved Granddad's cognitive decline had been worse than anyone realized, and that his medical team had failed to properly assess his mental competency during the estate planning process. He claimed his medical expertise gave him special insight into age-related mental deterioration, and that no rational person would make such obviously unfair distribution decisions without external influence, coercion, or significantly impaired judgment. He suggested that Granddad's cancer treatments had severely affected his cognitive function and memory formation, making him particularly susceptible to influence from someone he saw more frequently than other family members and who had unlimited access to manipulate his perceptions and decisions. But the lawyer cut through their hysteria with a calm, knowing smile that suggested he'd been expecting exactly this reaction and was fully prepared for any legal challenges they could possibly mount against the inheritance decision. He explained that Granddad had been meticulously preparing for this moment for over 18 months, ever since receiving his initial cancer diagnosis and realizing he needed to make final arrangements for his estate and business holdings that would withstand legal scrutiny. He'd undergone multiple comprehensive cognitive evaluations with 3 different specialists to prove his mental competency was completely intact throughout his illness, including detailed psychological testing, memory assessments, decision-making evaluations, and competency examinations that exceeded legal requirements. He'd filmed several detailed video testimonies explaining his decision with crystal clarity and devastating specificity about each family member's behavior, motivations, and documented patterns of financial exploitation. He'd even hired a licensed private investigator with extensive experience in family financial disputes to document each family member's true motivations for their sudden renewed interest in his well-being and their specific requests for financial assistance over the past several years of his declining health. The inheritance was completely ironclad, backed by months of legal preparation, psychological evaluations, documented evidence, professional testimony, and comprehensive legal strategies that would withstand any court challenge they could possibly mount. The lawyer had anticipated every possible legal argument and prepared comprehensive defenses against claims of undue influence, mental incompetency, inheritance fraud, or elder abuse. The numbers the lawyer rattled off were staggering beyond my wildest comprehension or imagination. The family house was worth $2.3 million after recent renovations and improvements that Granddad had made over the past decade to maintain its historical character while updating its systems and amenities. The manufacturing business, which I didn't even know Granddad owned until that moment, was professionally valued at $8. $2 million, including all equipment, inventory, contracts, intellectual property, and future earning potential based on current market conditions and growth projections. The various investment accounts contained another $4.7 million in carefully diversified stocks, bonds, retirement funds, and international investments that generated substantial passive income and had been professionally managed for optimal growth and risk mitigation. There were rental properties in 3 different states worth a combined $3.1 million, professionally managed and generating consistent rental income from long-term tenants who'd been carefully screened and maintained stable tenancy for years. Antique collections professionally appraised at over $800,000 included rare furniture, artwork, jewelry, and collectibles that Granddad had accumulated over decades of careful collecting and expert curation. Additional stock portfolios I'd never heard mentioned in any family conversation contained another $1.2 million in blue-chip stocks, emerging market investments, and technology sector holdings that had performed exceptionally well over the past several years. The total inheritance was worth over $20 million, making me suddenly one of the wealthiest people in our entire county, and possibly the surrounding region, with more money than I could reasonably spend in several lifetimes, even with extravagant habits and poor financial management. I was instantly transformed from a gas station employee living paycheck to paycheck into a multimillionaire with generational wealth and the financial freedom to pursue any goals or interests without concern for basic survival or economic security. The transformation in the room was immediate and absolutely nauseating to witness firsthand. My cousin, who just called me a manipulative sociopathic con artist worthy of criminal prosecution and public shaming, suddenly grabbed my arm with both hands and started talking earnestly about family loyalty and how blood relatives should always stick together during difficult times like these, especially when facing outside scrutiny and potential legal challenges. Her voice took on a completely different tone, warm and conciliatory instead of accusatory and hostile, as if the previous 10 minutes of vicious attacks had never happened. Mom stopped crying abruptly and began reminiscing about how proud she'd always been of my kindness, compassion, and special relationship with Granddad, conveniently forgetting decades of disappointment, criticism, and public embarrassment about my failures and life choices that had dominated every family interaction. She started talking about family traditions, holiday memories, and how important it was to maintain unity during times of grief and financial transition, as if she hadn't just accused me of elder abuse and inheritance fraud in front of witnesses and court recording equipment. Uncle mentioned a fantastic business opportunity he'd love to discuss with me privately, something about expanding into new international markets with my newfound resources and his extensive industry connections and decades of business expertise. He suggested we schedule a meeting to explore partnership opportunities that could benefit the entire family, while growing the inherited wealth responsibly for future generations and creating employment opportunities for family members. Sister wondered aloud if I might need professional help managing such a large and complex inheritance, offering her husband's financial expertise and suggesting that family members would obviously provide better guidance than outside advisors who didn't understand our personal values, long-term goals, and family dynamics that had been developed over generations of shared experiences. She started talking about family investment strategies, wealth preservation techniques, and how we could all work together to grow the inheritance responsibly while maintaining the family legacy that Granddad had worked so hard to build over his lifetime of sacrifice and careful planning. The shamelessness was absolutely breathtaking to observe in real time. These were the exact same people who'd spent years making me feel worthless and excluded from family gatherings because I didn't fit their narrow definition of success and achievement, who'd whispered about my failures at every holiday dinner while eating food I'd helped prepare and clean up afterward, who'd seated me with small children because my presence embarrassed them in front of their successful friends and professional colleagues who represented their social aspirations. I stood up slowly, still clutching Granddad's letter in my trembling hands, and looked at each of their desperate, calculating faces in turn. The expressions were identical across all of them. Barely concealed panic, mixed with frantic attempts to recalculate their approach to someone who'd just become incredibly valuable to their financial futures and personal security. I didn't say a single word to any of them. I just walked out of that sterile conference room and drove straight to Granddad's house, my house now, leaving them to argue among themselves about legal challenges, family loyalty, inheritance distribution strategies, and damage control for their public behavior during the reading. The next few weeks passed in a surreal blur of paperwork, meetings, and life-changing decisions that I felt completely unprepared to handle responsibly. I quit my job at the gas station, much to my manager's shock and disappointment since I'd been one of his most reliable employees for over 3 years and had never called in sick or missed a shift without advance notice. He genuinely cared about my well-being and had given me extra shifts whenever I needed money for rent, car repairs, or medical expenses, treating me with more respect and kindness than my own family had shown over the years. Leaving him felt like abandoning someone who'd actually been supportive when my own family had written me off as hopeless and worthless. He wished me well but seemed hurt that I was leaving so suddenly without giving proper notice or training a replacement, though he understood that my circumstances had changed dramatically and I couldn't continue working there given my new responsibilities and financial situation. The inheritance came with far more than just money. There were serious responsibilities I'd never anticipated or prepared for mentally and emotionally. The manufacturing business employed 43 people who depended on their weekly paychecks to support their families, pay mortgages, afford healthcare, and send their children to college. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were real people with real lives who could be devastated if I made poor decisions or failed to maintain the business successfully. There were long-term rental properties with tenants who'd lived there for years, some of them elderly people on fixed incomes who relied on Granddad's below-market rents to afford housing in an increasingly expensive area where gentrification was pricing out working families. There were charitable commitments Granddad had made to local organizations, scholarship funds he'd established for underprivileged students, and a complex web of investments that required constant attention and expertise I didn't possess. I was suddenly responsible for other people's livelihoods and well-being in ways that felt overwhelming and terrifying. Every decision I made could affect dozens of families, and I had no experience managing anything more complex than my own minimal expenses and gas station responsibilities. I hired the best financial advisors, lawyers, and accountants money could buy, determined not to squander what Granddad had built through decades of hard work, careful planning, and strategic decision-making. During the intensive process of learning about my new responsibilities, I discovered that Granddad had been testing me in subtle ways I never realized at the time, evaluating my character and judgment through seemingly casual conversations about business ethics and social responsibility. He'd casually mentioned business problems during our visits, carefully watching how I responded to hear whether I'd suggest ethical solutions that protected employees and customers, or quick profit schemes that might maximize short-term gains at the expense of long-term sustainability and worker welfare. When I'd suggested he talk directly to his workers about productivity issues, instead of just firing people to cut labor costs and improve profit margins, he'd taken detailed notes about my reasoning and followed up with questions about implementation strategies and employee relations. When I'd mentioned that his rental properties seemed overpriced for their neighborhoods after driving past them during our visits, he'd quietly investigated and discovered his property manager had been systematically overcharging tenants and skimming the excess profits for years while falsifying maintenance records and neglecting necessary repairs. He'd been grooming me to take over his business empire without me having any idea what was happening, testing my character, integrity, and judgment through seemingly casual conversations about ethics, responsibility, and the proper treatment of employees and tenants who depended on fair dealing and honest management. The family harassment campaign began almost immediately after the funeral, coordinated through their group chat and social media networks with military precision and sophisticated planning. My phone rang constantly with calls from blocked numbers, some threatening legal action and criminal charges, others offering fake reconciliation if I'd agree to share the inheritance, fairly according to what they claimed were Granddad's true intentions and the family's legitimate expectations. Mom left increasingly tearful and manipulative voicemails about how she couldn't afford her mortgage payments anymore, now that her expected inheritance was gone, and how the financial stress was affecting her health, sleep, and ability to function normally in her daily life. She'd counted on that money to pay off her credit card debt and fund her retirement lifestyle, never mind that she'd never contributed anything to Granddad's wealth creation or well-being during his illness. She painted herself as a victim of my greed and manipulation, claiming that my actions had destroyed her financial security and forced her to consider bankruptcy, downsizing, or other drastic measures to survive financially. She implied that I was morally obligated to share the inheritance because family members should support each other during difficult times, ignoring her own documented behavior during Granddad's final months. Uncle sent threatening legal documents through his attorney, claiming Granddad had verbally promised him the business years ago during a handshake agreement that supposedly dozens of witnesses could verify, even though he couldn't produce any documentation, written evidence, or credible testimony to support such claims. His lawyer's letters became increasingly aggressive, threatening criminal charges for elder abuse and inheritance fraud if I didn't voluntarily agree to redistribute the assets according to what they claimed were Granddad's true intentions. The legal threats were clearly designed to intimidate me into settling out of court rather than risk expensive litigation, negative publicity, or criminal investigation. Uncle was counting on my inexperience with legal matters and my natural desire to avoid conflict to pressure me into giving up substantial portions of the inheritance without a fight. My cousin launched a sophisticated and well-funded social media campaign painting herself as the innocent victim of a cruel inheritance theft orchestrated by a master manipulator who'd spent years planning this elaborate scheme. She hired a professional public relations firm to craft her messaging and started a crowdfunding page claiming I'd stolen her children's college funds through years of emotional manipulation of a vulnerable elderly man who'd lost his ability to think clearly due to age and illness. Her post went viral in our local community and beyond, generating thousands of dollars in sympathy donations and widespread outrage about elder abuse among people who'd never met our family, but were moved by her carefully crafted victim narrative and professional photography. The campaign included heartbreaking photos of her children looking sad and worried about their uncertain future without the college funds they'd been promised. Local news stations picked up the story after her PR firm pitched it as a cautionary tale about inheritance fraud and family manipulation, interviewing family friends who swore Granddad had always intended to divide his wealth equally among all his grandchildren. They found former neighbors who remembered Granddad talking about leaving something for everyone, conveniently ignoring the context that he'd been discussing small personal mementos rather than major financial assets. The media coverage painted me as a calculating sociopath who'd spent years gaining an elderly man's trust specifically to steal millions from his rightful heirs. Expert commentators discussed inheritance fraud, the vulnerability of elderly people to family manipulation, and the warning signs that families should watch for when elderly relatives change their wills unexpectedly. Sister was by far the worst in her harassment tactics and emotional manipulation strategies. She showed up at my new house, Granddad's house, with her 3 young children in tow, claiming they deserved to see the home their inheritance money had been used to maintain over the years. She brought local news crews with her, staging elaborate scenes of her children crying about losing their college funds while she delivered tearful interviews about how I'd systematically destroyed their family's financial security through calculated manipulation. The staged photo opportunities were particularly manipulative and designed to generate maximum emotional impact from viewers who didn't know the full story. Sister had her children pose sadly outside the house gates, looking through the iron bars like they were locked out of their rightful home by a cruel relative who'd stolen their birthright through deception and manipulation. She gave interviews while holding her youngest daughter, talking about how the child would never be able to attend private school, take music lessons, or participate in extracurricular activities because her college fund had been stolen by a family member who'd betrayed their trust and destroyed their future opportunities. The media attention was brutal and relentless, turning me into a local pariah overnight and making it impossible to go anywhere without being recognized and confronted by strangers who'd seen the news coverage. Reporters camped outside my house for weeks, following me to business meetings and shouting questions about elder abuse allegations, inheritance fraud, and my relationship with Granddad during his final months. They interviewed former co-workers at the gas station, looking for any evidence of questionable character, financial desperation, or suspicious behavior that might support the family's narrative about my supposed criminal activities and history of manipulation. They dug through my credit history, employment records, college transcripts, criminal background checks, anything that might suggest I was capable of the sophisticated long-term manipulation they were alleging. Local television stations ran nightly segments about the case, bringing in expert commentators to discuss inheritance fraud and the vulnerability of elderly people to family manipulation. The coverage painted me as a calculating sociopath who'd spent years gaining an old man's trust specifically to steal millions from his rightful heirs, who had legitimate expectations based on family relationships and previous discussions. Online comment sections were filled with people calling for my arrest and demanding justice for the victimized family members who'd been robbed of their rightful inheritance through what appeared to be an elaborate long-term fraud scheme. But I had Granddad's comprehensive investigation files, and they contained evidence that would completely destroy the family's narrative and expose their true motivations to public scrutiny. For over a year before his death, he'd been systematically documenting every interaction with family members, building an airtight case to support his final decision and protect me from the legal challenges he knew would come. There were hundreds of recorded phone calls where they discussed his assets like he was already dead and buried, calculating inheritance splits and complaining about having to visit him in the hospital during his treatments. Photos taken by his private investigator showed them going through his belongings during visits, clearly cataloging valuable items for future reference and taking pictures with their phones to research resale values and auction potential. Screenshots of family group chat conversations revealed their true motivations with devastating clarity, showing detailed discussions about inheritance distribution, estate planning strategies, and timeline concerns related to his declining health. They calculated inheritance splits down to the penny, complained about his longevity interfering with their financial planning and investment strategies, and strategized about how to maximize their individual shares while minimizing tax obligations and legal complications. There were discussions about his medical care that focused entirely on costs and timing, rather than his comfort, wishes, or quality of life during his final months. They'd even researched the average life expectancy for his specific type of cancer and discussed whether his expensive treatments were worth the financial cost given his limited time remaining and the impact on their potential inheritance amounts. The private investigator had been incredibly thorough in his surveillance work, documenting patterns of behavior over many months with professional-grade equipment and techniques. There were financial records showing how each family member had suddenly become generous with gifts and visits after Granddad's first heart attack, clearly motivated by inheritance concerns rather than genuine affection or family loyalty. Restaurant receipts from family dinners where I wasn't invited, complete with detailed notes about who brought up money during each conversation and how they justified their requests for financial assistance or investment opportunities. Even parking garage security footage showed my cousin meeting secretly with estate planning attorneys weeks before Granddad's death, obviously trying to contest the will before it was even finalized or made public. She'd been researching legal strategies for challenging inheritance decisions while publicly playing the role of devoted granddaughter who only wanted to spend quality time with her beloved grandfather during his final months. The most damaging evidence was a series of recordings where family members discussed strategies for influencing Granddad's medical decisions to speed up the inheritance process and reduce the financial burden of his treatment on their future inheritance. They'd researched which treatments were most expensive and least likely to succeed, suggesting he should consider refusing aggressive interventions that might prolong his suffering while draining family resources. Their concern wasn't for his quality of life, comfort, or personal wishes. It was for the mounting medical expenses that were reducing their expected inheritance amounts and delaying the distribution process they were eagerly anticipating. When Sister's sob story aired on the evening news, generating massive public sympathy and calls for criminal investigation into my supposed crimes, I decided it was time to release everything Granddad had collected. I held a press conference with the same lawyer who'd read the will, presenting the evidence methodically and letting the facts speak for themselves without editorial commentary or emotional appeals. The public revelation was absolutely devastating for the entire family, destroying their reputations and credibility overnight in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The same media outlets that had portrayed me as a heartless predator suddenly ran exposés about the family's systematic greed and manipulation of a dying man. My cousin's crowdfunding campaign was immediately shut down for fraud after donors realized they'd been completely lied to about the circumstances and had been manipulated into supporting a false narrative. The thousands of dollars she'd collected had to be returned to angry donors, and several filed police reports about being scammed through deliberately false information and emotional manipulation. The crowdfunding platform banned her permanently and flagged her case as an example of inheritance fraud for their fraud prevention training materials. Mom lost her job at the bank after her employer reviewed the recorded conversations where she discussed Granddad's death like a business opportunity and calculated exactly how much money she needed him to die quickly to solve her personal financial problems. The bank's board of directors decided her behavior reflected poorly on their institution's values and professional ethics standards, terminating her employment immediately and reviewing all her previous client interactions for potential ethical violations. Uncle's legal challenge collapsed spectacularly when the court reviewed Granddad's comprehensive video testimony and supporting documentation that clearly demonstrated his mental competency and detailed understanding of his decision. In crystal-clear recordings made just weeks before his death, my grandfather calmly explained each family member's behavior in devastating detail, showing evidence of their manipulation attempts, their constant requests for money, and their complete lack of genuine care for his well-being beyond his financial value to them. He looked directly into the camera with perfect clarity and said, "Sometimes the black sheep is black because the rest of the flock is rotten to the core. They excluded this boy from their schemes because he had the character they lacked. He never asked for anything because he understood that love isn't transactional. Now they're learning that karma isn't either." The judge didn't just dismiss Uncle's case, he ordered Uncle to pay all court costs and legal fees, calling the challenge frivolous and potentially fraudulent given the overwhelming evidence of the family's true motivations and their complete lack of credible evidence supporting their claims. The local bar association opened an investigation into Uncle's attorney for filing obviously false claims about verbal inheritance promises that couldn't be substantiated with any credible evidence or documentation. But the inheritance came with massive unexpected complications that money couldn't easily solve, and responsibilities that kept me awake at night worrying about other people's livelihoods. The manufacturing business was struggling far more than Granddad had ever let on during our conversations, probably to avoid worrying me or influencing my behavior toward him with knowledge of financial pressures and business challenges. Foreign competitors were systematically undercutting prices on major contracts. Key clients were jumping ship to cheaper alternatives overseas, where labor costs were a fraction of domestic rates, and much of the equipment desperately needed expensive updates to remain competitive in rapidly evolving markets where technology changed constantly, and efficiency improvements were essential for survival. I faced an immediate choice between protecting my newfound wealth through conservative financial management and saving 43 jobs that supported 43 families in our economically depressed town, where good employment opportunities were increasingly rare and unemployment benefits barely covered basic living expenses. I chose the jobs without hesitation, even though it meant risking millions of dollars and potentially losing everything Granddad had built if my business decisions proved wrong or market conditions continued deteriorating. I invested over $2.8 million in brand new equipment and comprehensive worker training programs that would give us competitive advantages over overseas manufacturers who relied on cheap labor rather than advanced technology and skilled workers. I hired expensive consultants to help modernize our operations, identify new market opportunities, and develop innovative products that would set us apart from cheaper competitors who competed solely on price rather than quality or innovation. I spent months learning the business from the ground up, working alongside employees who'd known Granddad for decades and understood the industry far better than I ever could. We redesigned our entire production process, improved quality control systems, and developed innovative new products that commanded premium prices in specialized markets where quality mattered more than cost and customers valued reliability over bargain pricing. The transformation took nearly a year of intensive work and substantial financial investment, but slowly we turned the business around and made it more profitable than it had ever been under Granddad's management, creating a sustainable competitive advantage based on quality, innovation, and customer service rather than simply undercutting competitors on price. The rental properties presented their own complex moral dilemmas that tested my values daily and forced me to balance compassion with financial responsibility in ways I'd never experienced before. Granddad had been an unusually generous landlord, often letting tenants slide on rent payments during medical emergency, job losses, or family crises that left them temporarily unable to pay their full monthly obligations. The properties desperately needed major repairs and updates to remain safe, habitable, and competitive with other rental options in the area, but raising rents to market rates would displace families who'd lived there for years and couldn't afford higher housing costs in our increasingly gentrified community where property values had skyrocketed beyond the reach of working families. I had to balance basic financial responsibility and property maintenance with the compassion Granddad had always shown his tenants, many of whom were elderly people on fixed incomes or working families struggling to make ends meet in an economy that offered few opportunities for advancement or wage growth. I decided to keep the rents artificially low and absorb the repair costs myself, even though it meant hundreds of thousands of dollars less income each year and significantly slower return on investment compared to market rate properties. It was the right thing to do, but it meant sacrificing substantial profits to maintain affordable housing in a community where working families were being systematically priced out by developers who only cared about maximum profits and return on investment. A year after the inheritance, the transformation was remarkable and exceeded my most optimistic expectations for both business success and community impact. The manufacturing business was not only profitable again, but thriving beyond anything Granddad had achieved, having landed 3 major long-term contracts and successfully expanded into 2 new product lines that generated premium pricing and higher profit margins than our traditional offerings. We'd increased every employee's salary by at least 15% and restored the comprehensive health insurance benefits that had been cut during previous financial struggles when Granddad was trying to keep the company afloat during economic downturns and increased foreign competition. Several employees had been able to buy homes, send their children to college, and achieve financial security they'd never thought possible working in manufacturing. The rental properties were completely renovated and occupied by happy tenants paying fair rents in a housing market where similar properties cost twice as much and offered fewer amenities and services. I'd established an emergency fund to help tenants during temporary financial hardships, and several families had used it to avoid eviction during medical emergencies, job transitions, and family crises that would otherwise have left them homeless. My personal investment portfolio had grown by 38% through careful management and strategic reinvestment of profits from the business operations, rather than simply extracting maximum dividends for personal use. The antique collections had been professionally appraised and properly insured, with several pieces donated to local museums for public display where they could be appreciated by the broader community rather than hidden in private storage. I'd established a charitable foundation in Granddad's name that supported local education initiatives, healthcare programs for uninsured workers, and scholarship opportunities for students from low-income families who showed academic promise but lacked financial resources for higher education. But the real transformation was personal and psychological, changing my entire sense of identity and purpose in ways I never could have anticipated. I'd gone from being the family failure to someone that dozens of people depended on for their livelihoods and well-being. Employees brought me their personal problems because they trusted my judgment and knew I genuinely cared about their welfare beyond their productivity at work. Tenants thanked me regularly for maintaining affordable housing in a community where most working families were being displaced by gentrification and profit-driven development that prioritized wealthy buyers over long-term residents. Local charities that Granddad had quietly supported for years continued receiving substantial donations, allowing them to expand their programs and serve more people in need. The scholarship fund had already helped 12 students attend college who otherwise couldn't have afforded higher education, and several had returned to work in the community after graduation, creating a positive cycle of investment and return that benefited everyone. The family eventually stopped their harassment campaign when it became clear that public opinion had turned completely against them, and their legal challenges had no merit whatsoever. They moved on to other grievances and schemes, largely pretending I no longer existed except when they needed something that only my resources could provide. Mom remarried a wealthy widower she met at a grief counseling group and made sure everyone knew she didn't need my money anymore, though she continued to make indirect requests for financial assistance through other family members and mutual friends who didn't understand the full history of our relationship. Uncle started a podcast about elder abuse and inheritance disputes, carefully avoiding any specific mention of his own documented behavior while positioning himself as an expert on family financial conflicts and the warning signs of inheritance fraud. His restaurant eventually failed completely, and he declared bankruptcy after several failed business ventures that followed the same pattern of poor planning and unrealistic expectations. My cousin became a life coach specializing in overcoming family trauma and financial disappointment, monetizing her victim narrative by selling courses on resilience and recovery to people who didn't know the real story behind her circumstances. She'd completely rewritten the story of her inheritance loss, portraying it as a blessing that taught her the true meaning of success and happiness beyond material wealth. Her social media presence was carefully curated to show her thriving despite the setback, though I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd had to sell her house and move to a smaller apartment while struggling to maintain her previous lifestyle on her actual income rather than expected inheritance. Sister was the only family member who eventually reached out with what seemed like genuine remorse rather than calculated manipulation designed to gain access to my resources. 2 years after the inheritance, she sent a long handwritten letter admitting that losing her expected windfall had forced her to confront her sense of entitlement and materialism that had poisoned her relationships and distorted her values for years. She explained that the financial crisis had forced her to get a real job for the first time in over a decade and start therapy to address her dependency on other people's money for her sense of security and self-worth. She was slowly rebuilding her life without expecting handouts from anyone, learning to find satisfaction in her own achievements rather than inherited wealth or her husband's financial success. Her letter was specific about the changes she'd made, selling the mansion and moving to a modest house they could actually afford, enrolling her children in public school where they could develop normal social relationships, taking a position at a nonprofit organization that helped families in financial crisis understand their options and resources. She asked for nothing except the chance to apologize for her behavior during Granddad's final months and the inheritance dispute that followed, acknowledging that her actions had been motivated by greed and entitlement rather than genuine grief or family loyalty. I read her letter carefully multiple times, looking for hidden agendas or subtle requests for financial assistance, but it seemed genuinely focused on accountability and personal growth rather than reconciliation that might lead to future benefits or access to my resources. Still, I didn't respond to her letter. Some damage can't be undone with words, no matter how sincere they might seem, and I wasn't ready to risk reopening old wounds or creating new opportunities for manipulation and disappointment. 3 years after Granddad's death, I found myself standing at his grave on the anniversary, carrying his favorite yellow roses and a detailed report about everything I'd accomplished with his legacy. I told him about the business successes, the employee bonuses, the families who could afford to stay in their homes because of reasonable rent policies that prioritized people over profits. I described the scholarship fund we'd established for local students pursuing manufacturing careers and the healthcare clinic we'd funded for uninsured workers who couldn't afford medical care through traditional insurance systems. I explained how his investigation had protected me from the family's legal challenges and public relations attacks, allowing me to focus on building rather than defending. I thanked him for seeing potential in me that I'd never recognized in myself, for teaching me that personal worth isn't measured by wealth, but that wealth can be measured by the positive impact you have on other people's lives and opportunities. As I walked away from his headstone toward the car, I realized the real inheritance had never been the money, properties, or business assets that everyone else had coveted. The true gift was the lesson that being rejected by a toxic system isn't personal failure. It's often a blessing in disguise that reveals your true character and potential. Sometimes you have to be cast out by the wrong people to discover exactly who you're meant to become and what you're truly capable of achieving when you're free from their limitations and expectations. The gas station where I used to work still displays a framed newspaper clipping about my business success on the wall behind the counter. The headline reads, "Local man inherits fortune, saves jobs, transforms community." But the real story isn't about money or revenge or family drama or even justice being served to people who deserved consequences for their behavior. It's about a grandfather who loved his grandson enough to give him both the financial means and the moral responsibility to become a better person than the family that had rejected him for 26 years. It's about understanding that love isn't about what you can get from someone, but what you're willing to give without expecting anything in return. And sometimes, that kind of unconditional love and faith in someone's potential is worth more than all the money in the world, because it teaches you how to use wealth as a tool for good, rather than just personal enrichment or social status. The inheritance changed my bank account, but Granddad's love changed my life in ways that no amount of money ever could.